Welcome, everyone, to this briefing brought to you by the Israel Defense and Security Forum, IDSF. In Hebrew, our name is Abitchonistim. IDSF is a leading Israeli organization advocating for strong national security to defend Israel. It's a great pleasure to be joined today by Barak Seener. Barak, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much for hosting me, Moshe.
And thank you, of course, to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning into this briefing so that we can really bring you some analysis behind the headlines of what is happening in Israel. I'm super excited to talk with Barak today. Barak is at the Henry Jackson Society, and he is the host of a podcast called The Geo Godfathers Wars. And I'm going to share that link to his podcast. Highly recommend to listen to his analysis. I'll share that link momentarily. And I actually heard Barak speaking at an IDSF event we had in Hashmonaim a few weeks ago, and I said, wow, I got to get him to share this with our viewers. So Barak, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Moshe.
Let's just jump straight in. Of course, there is this ceasefire deal with Hezbollah, with Lebanon, and it has broader implications for Iran, for the incoming administration in the US. Jump in, tell me your thoughts.
Look, on one hand, Israel needs the ceasefire. Um, One of the ways that you can identify the way in which a country is able to project power is its force capacity, its power projection capabilities, the toll it's taking on its economy and its social impact as well. And its as well capabilities to independently um, produce munitions. Now, Israel's economy has taken a huge hit, and the reservists are exhausted. They have done multiple tours in the military, and it's contributed to divorce, it's contributed to unemployment. You have a demoralized sentiment in Israel, and Israel needs the ceasefire in order to kind of just breathe. What I'm afraid of about the ceasefire is that Hezbollah has maintained its capabilities to launch rockets at Israel. So what you see here is a type of conflict whereby it's become organic, decentralized, and even a flat structure, whereby even if you take out Hezbollah's command and control, you take out all its senior leaders, um, the lower ranks are able to function autonomously, right? And that threat remains. That threat still prompts, you can wipe out the command and control, but yet 60,000 Israelis will still be displaced from their homes. So, on one hand, Israel can pat itself on the back in order for successfully launching this intel-led operation that has decapitated the command and control, but at the same time, it's left with a well-entrenched, organic, grassroots level of operative that is still able to hold Israel to ransom, and that's quite significant. So it demonstrates how warfare has evolved. I think that when Israel says that it has eliminated 80% of Hezbollah's rocket capabilities, I think that's probably a bit over ambitious. I know that Israel now has a more forward-leaning posture to strike at um, weapons that are being transferred from Iran to Lebanon. However, um, the frustrating thing is, and the flawed strategy that Israel has, is that it's always focusing on targeting Iran's proxies as opposed to the source itself. Fine, it may eliminate, it could have a grand operation to eliminate Iran's air defenses. However, Israel needs a more concerted effort to destabilize the regime and to send a clear message to the regime that we are not going to make a distinction between the sponsor and its surrogates. We're going to conflate the two. And we are going to be holding, for any rocket that is launched at Israel, Tehran directly will have to pay the price for it. That's a message that Israel has failed to do. There's a lot more that Israel could be doing to restore deterrence and hasn't done so, partly because of pressure from the US administration. However, this is something that Israel really has to do on its own accord.
Now, I've seen you write and speak about the strategy of appeasement that the U.S. has towards Iran. I'm wondering if you can speak to what a ceasefire means to Iran. Is that part of this appeasement strategy? And Iran has won because the West and Israel are giving in. How is it perceived right now?
If I was a mullah in the Iranian regime, this would be my calculus. I'd be thinking, okay, we have alienated Israel diplomatically to the point that the ICC has issued warrants for Gallant and Netanyahu, which is incredibly significant. Um, I would also think we have, to a large degree, not fully, but to a large degree, we have established strategic depth, and we are we are shielded by our proxies. So our proxies have taken an enormous hit, but we have destabilized the region. We've exhausted Israel. We've given its economy a pummeling. We've delegitimized it, and we've not been held directly to account, right? Um, we've also stopped the Abraham Accords, which undoubtedly the Trump administration will seek to revive because that's its legacy that it will want to deepen and expand. However, we've created for Israel a massive problem in terms of the day after for Gaza, to the point that Saudi Arabia has had to make the statement that normalization of ties is contingent upon uh, a Palestinian state, which it hadn't said beforehand. MBS was on the brink of making a peace agreement with Israel. Um, so we've stopped that dead in its tracks. How does Saudi Arabia backpedal from those statements, right? Maybe a Trump administration can give it incentives to do so. However, it's definitely thrown Iran has proved to be an enormous regional disruptor, not only on October the 7th, but for the past year since then. So that has been quite a success. In the meantime, there's been a convergence, a closer convergence between the axes of resistance, Iran, China, and Russia, offering each other logistical support and support in terms of weaponry. Um, so Iran has managed to place itself further in this other camp. So all these are enormous achievements, and Iran hasn't been sufficiently taken into account as a result of this.
You know, we tend to look at the military success against Hezbollah and Hamas, and even, of course, Iran, and you're really giving a different spin on it. That at the end of the day, they may have become degraded militarily, but at the end of the day, they're still around and they're still building this axis of resistance. I'm curious, you had this,
May I just stop
yeah.
you there? Well, just think about that when an organization is organic, that in turn makes it resilient. If an organization is inorganic and hierarchical, then it has less resilience. So Hezbollah has been able to survive, adapt. Of course, it's been scaled back enormously, but the question is, to what extent will Israel's intelligence on the ground and forward-facing operations within the framework of a ceasefire set continually set Hezbollah back? A terrorist organization is like a disease. It's always able to mutate and adapt. And we can see, that there's been 2 decades worth of ignoring Hezbollah, allowing Iran to mold the region in its image, um, set the strategic agenda. Um, and you cannot do that overnight. You can't set it back overnight.
Now, the timing of this ceasefire being in this kind of time where the old administration is on their way out, the new administration in the U.S. is on its way in. What are your thoughts on how that piece relates to this ceasefire? Is it possible to suggest that with one administration or the other, there is this broader look at, what it could have the impact it could have with Iran, as opposed to just Israel's in the immediate here and now dealing with the symptom?
Okay, I'm obviously going to speculate because it's a speculative question, but I would speculate that had there not been an incoming Trump administration, and had it been a Harris administration that would have effectively have been a continuation of this one that prioritized de-escalation, which in turn provoked Iran to to maintain its malign activities or establish new norms of terrorism, then Iran would not be keen on there being a ceasefire. I think that the combination of Israel's operations in Lebanon, its willingness to broaden the scope of its operations into Beirut, for example, as well as a Trump administration that is going to be very, very unpredictable, but he has a very anti-Iranian stance that will definitely induce the regime in Iran to actually step back, press the pause button on it, and in the meantime attempt to reconstitute its proxies, because that's what they do during ceasefires. They seek to replenish. And so it's strategically sound for Iran to have this ceasefire with an incoming administration that will be a lot more hostile towards it.
So what does Israel do in this interim period in order to set the stage to dismantle, if possible, the regime in Iran, as opposed to always just dealing with the symptoms?
Look, I think that there needs to be multiple measures that need to be taken in order for Israel to effectively project its power more broadly in the region in an unabashed manner. I mean, the one lesson that Israel must take from October the 7th is that it cannot simply play defense. It has to own the role of being the rising tiger of the region. If Israel, it doesn't have the, I think in the past, Israel had a mindset of we can adopt a survival posture, a defensive posture, a reactive posture, and that's enough for us to survive. Today, you don't have that choice of survive or die. Today, the choice is thrive or die. And in order for Israel to thrive, what I think it needs to do is it needs, on a political level, to work with the US administration to empower the Lebanese government and the Lebanese military, deploy a lot of intelligence assets and financial um, resources to prevent Iran from inserting its proxies and effectively taking over the Lebanese forces. Um, and I think, and that would entail as well, perhaps trade ties, increased economic ties and trade ties with the Lebanese government. There must be that degree of political and economic inducement to, in order that, that in order for Israel to establish its own strategic depth, it can only establish its strategic depth if there is a kind of political peace on its borders. The second thing that Israel has to do is it does need to say to the Iranian regime that any attacks by Iranian proxies, whether it be from Yemen, Iraq, the West Bank, which is the next big thing, Lebanon, um, anything that is conducted, any malign activities by Iranian proxies will be held accountable by Iran itself. So Israel has to be willing to target IRGC facilities, oil terminals, more nuclear facilities, perhaps assassination of scientists and personnel on Iran. Um, Israel doesn't need to distinguish between proxies and the sponsor, or outside of Iranian territory or on Iranian soil. And to a great degree, what's helped Israel overcome these distinctions, these doctrinal and strategic distinctions, has been Iran's willingness to directly target Israel from Iranian soil. Um, so Israel's response must be disproportionate, because that's also what a rising tiger would be doing. And that's the only way that Israel can prove itself as a useful strategic asset to America, and also close the region off for increased intervention by Russia and China in the region.
Okay, first, Barak, I want to share your link to your podcast. So if anyone who's watching on our live Zoom briefing, you can look in the chat and you can hear Barak with his fascinating analysis on the podcast. And if you're listening on YouTube, please, of course, consider subscribing and liking the channel. And also in the description of the YouTube video, you will see a link where you can sign up for the live briefings, and then you can get all the things that we share in these live Zoom briefings. Barak, a lot of people are sending in questions. They always know how to find me and get the questions on the chat or my phone, email, whatever it is. And the question is, are you putting too much faith in Lebanon, the Lebanese government, the Lebanese army? Meaning you talk about Lebanon stepping up to partner with Israel to make sure that Hezbollah disarms itself. Unfortunately, history has shown us, let's say back in 2006, that they're not a reliable partner. So your optimism is it optimism, or is it tied to reality of what can be?
I think Israel, as opposed to the past, Israel has to maintain some kind of permanent presence in Lebanon. This has to be coupled with a coordination between Israel and Washington on how to support the Lebanese government. In the past, what would have happened was Israel would have gone to war with Lebanon, with Hezbollah, and once it was over, it would have withdrawn, and then Hezbollah would have, crossed the Litani River again, and been overseen by mindless UNIFIL observers. So I think this is something very, very different. It has to be um, comprehensive strategic approach led by Israel and Washington, with Israel maintaining forward posture, forward-facing posture in Lebanon. Um, Partly because of what I was saying before, Israel cannot be purely reactive on its own borders anymore. It must project power more broadly.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, but we have time for more questions and so many questions coming in. And you mentioned Russia and China, and maybe we can delve into that for a minute. Russia's interest in broadening its power and its reach, and certainly its relationship with Iran. How does that factor into Israel's next move?
I think that, look, if you just focus simply on Ukraine, if I was having this conversation with you 10, 20 years ago, we would be able to separate the world into different regions. We would have spoken about globalization, but when we would have done so, it would have been at a mostly economic level. But today, when you see Russia seeking to gain military support from North Korea or receiving weapons from Iran, or Russia providing perhaps air defense systems to Iran, that is a degree of coordination that we wouldn't have seen a few decades ago. Similarly, Iran has a doctrine of, apart from the Ring of Fire, it has a doctrine of uniting the arenas, whereby it looks at Ukraine, it looks at the South China Seas, it looks at the Middle East, and it thinks, okay, how can we spill over to other domains, to other conflict theaters? Um, it obviously is aligned with their ambition to export the Iranian revolution as much as possible, but their malign activities now are being seen in Africa, in South America, in Ukraine. So it's not any more region specific. Similarly, China is very, very eager to enter the region. It's helping GCC countries diversify their economies and digitalize their economies. It's providing that digital infrastructure. It wants to increase its Belt Road Initiative, which is initially a trade and economic platform and a trade pathway, but then it gets reinforced by a diplomatic component, and then a security component. And increasingly, you see, in order just to justify China's access to international markets, they're going to want to increase their presence in the region. So it's not just about Russia. I really do see it as the axis of resistance. So there is a symbiotic relationship between Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. And where it contracts in one area, it expands in another, and vice versa.
Let me ask you the last question, another speculative question. When the US is considering its action in Iran, are they thinking about Iran or are they thinking about Russia?
I think what I worry about, I'm glad you said it's speculative, but I worry that an America first, it's quite paradoxical because Trump would speak about in terms of America first, but at the same time, he was a very international interventionist US president. He's very transactional, so he wants to see that his allies are, sharing their part of the bill in terms of their military expenditure. He doesn't want America to be sort of covering the cost itself. What I worry is that there may be a tendency in a future administration by some to treat these different conflict theaters in a distinct manner, and it would be appealing to do so because by perceiving that the world in this atomized and disjointed manner, things become much more manageable. Then it isn't a world war anymore, it's a regional conflict. Um, I think that they are intertwined, and the only way I think to split up to disrupt the axis of resistance is by treating it as an organic whole, as intertwined and symbiotic.
Barak, it's a great pleasure to speak with you. I very much enjoy hearing your analysis.
Thank you, Moshe,
And
for having me. I really appreciate it.
absolutely, this is again Barak Seener from the Henry Jackson Society. He has a great podcast, Geo Godfather's Wars. You can take a look at the link in the chat here. Thank you
By
to
the
all
way,
of our,
may I add,
please.
if anybody is interested, I published a report on Iran recently called "Restoring Deterrence, Destabilizing the Iranian Regime," and that may be a very useful read for people.
Barak, how do we share that? Is there a link? Is there a digital version of it?
I will find it. Can you give me a second?
Okay. Thank you again, Barak, and thank you to all of our viewers and all of our supporters for tuning in. Tomorrow is Thanksgiving in the US, and even though we're over here in Israel, we're going to take a day off from the briefing so everyone can enjoy their family and their turkey. And we'll be back with you next week Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. here in Israel. Barak has shared the link just in the nick of time. I'm sending it out, and everyone can read his report on restoring deterrence and destabilizing the Iranian regime. Barak, thank you for sharing that. And I wish everyone a happy Thanksgiving. Stay safe, stay strong, take care.